every investor, every human being today, be it an investment banker who is just professionally employed, who may have the potential of eventually becoming a family office, will fail if they forget that the number one reason why we do what we do is sustenance. Why do we see wealth getting blown up? Because people forget it starts with sustenance. It's about food on the table and shelter over your head.
Hey everyone, this is Prashant and I'll be your host for the VC 10X podcast. And today we have Princess Jahnavi Kumari Mewar with us. Jahnavi Kumari is a real life princess from the erstwhile royal state of Mewar, founder of Auctus Fora, an investment platform for global family offices to co-invest. Princess Jahnavi represents the 77th generation of India's most powerful and oldest royal family dynasty. In this episode, we talk about how Princess Jahnavi restructured her royal family office. 3 things to keep in mind in respect to capital management of any kind. How they maintain the delicate balance between capital growth and impact creation. Why there is a need for a global council of family offices to negate the power of high net worth individuals manipulating policy for individual and selfish gains. And so much more. So without wasting any time, let's dive straight in. This episode is sponsored by my own podcasting agency called Podcast 10X, where I help VCs start and run their own podcast. While I was running VC 10X, this podcast that you're listening to right now, I asked my VC guests, why don't you start your own podcast? I mean, it's the best form of marketing for VCs. As they say, VC is a people play more than even a capital play. A podcast enables you to put your people at the front, your portfolio founders, your partners, and co-investors. It's a great way to build a brand and win competitive deals. It activates all your marketing channels in a single shot, be it YouTube or blog post or newsletter or social media. Everything gets activated in a single shot. And I get the same response from all the VCs that it's a lot of work and we don't have the time for it. I said, all right, let me handle the work for you, from pre-recording, editing, publishing to making social media clips. All you have to do is show up on a call, hit record, do the recording using the well-researched outline we provide you with, and you're done. We handle everything else. You know what they said? All right, let's give it a shot. So if you are a VC and want to up your marketing and branding game, I'd love to work with you. And if you're thinking there are too many VC podcasts already, remember, there are way more VC firms out there. And if you're not standing out, you're losing out. So if you want to work with me on starting your podcast, go to podcast10x.com and book a call today. I'll add the link in the description and show notes below. Look forward to working with you. Kamagani, namaste, and a very warm welcome to Princess Jahnavi Kumari Mewar on the VC10X podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Very well, thank you, Prashant. How are you?
I'm doing very well as well, and very glad to be doing this with you. To start things off, can we first have briefly your story and how you started your investing career right when you were 16 at your father's investment firm?
Well, I wouldn't say that I started my investment career or investment activities at 16, because I mean, that would make me quite the prodigy, don't you think? But yes, I did start working with my father's investment company, which has only basically come into being in the late 90s, to create a little bit of structure around assets and, segregation of assets, more importantly, and of course, how to create divestment strategies, plus also reinvestment and find opportunities to invest surplus capital, which of course at the time used to be on scale at the lower end, because one was just, was in the rebuilding phase, as you can imagine. What the royal families in India went through, so did the entire family tree along with them. And so therefore, my first, I would say, official employment as an intern and as a trainee was at the age of 16. Of course, I was then employed very generous of my father to give me official employment and a permanent position at the age of 18. At 21, I did, from 18 onwards, of course, I began actively participating in advising, looking at, and analyzing the entire investment spectrum and landscape of activities within the company. At the age of 21, I was given over the responsibility for managing the private equity component of his real estate portfolio and a few other portfolio assets in other sectors. And at 23, I also then ended up inheriting the private structured credit portfolio. So that pretty much became the whole gamut of our investment activities. And from that point onwards, we ended up creating a bit more of a sophisticated structure. Of course, I'd already begun creating a family office structure around the investment company, but we obviously went into a bit more of a finessed form of in our investment activities by developing an in-house methodology called the reverse origination methodology, which I did in 2011. And now all our investment activities are anchored on the basis of this in-house proprietary methodology.
Totally, that's very interesting. And can you give us an insight into how the royal family offices have been managed over the years and what's changing with the newer generation coming in?
Prashant, I don't know how much I can speak of the internal workings of other families. I can probably most tolerably and intelligently talk about my own. And like I said, every family is very different in the way they approach, let's say, preservation and growth. Right. I think where all of us would be quite similar or very similar would be to identify where consolidation is required. Which also came after many, many years of a very challenging rebuilding phase, especially for, I would say, the senior members of any and all the royal families in India, due to obviously, various privy purses being reneged upon, there being literally no income, and there was a phase where there were these very, very clunky assets, beautiful but clunky, and to maintain these and to convert them into revenue generating, income earning assets also took I can only imagine that it was a Herculean effort. And of course, my father was part of perhaps a slightly later stage, but part of that whole process for, the whole family. And when it came down to it, I think if I was to talk about my own family, we've always looked at it from the point of view of preservation and gradual growth. Now, I could turn around and ask you, why do you do this podcast? And I would love to hear your answer, and then perhaps draw a parallel as to how families must have, perhaps at that time, or should move today and moving forward, look at, let's say, not just an investment portfolio, but in terms of managing their affairs. Let's call it that. Let's give it a slightly more broader description. So, why are you doing what you're doing? Tell me.
Totally. My goal obviously is to meet investors from around the world and learn from how they're doing their investing and in different sectors and different regions, and then also to have the privilege of meeting and hosting people like you on the podcast and to be able to ask you questions on a platform like this. So that's the reason I do this, and today is one of those days, which is the reason why I do this. So yeah.
Well, you're very kind, very generous and charming, and thank you for that. But that doesn't really answer my question. You're doing it because you want to gain knowledge and you meet interesting people, but are you monetizing it? And if you are, and even if you're not, that's perfectly fine, because sometimes we do things because we're passionate about them and not. And I
Yeah.
strongly believe not everything in this world needs to be monetized. Some things allow you that bit of respite from everyday life.
Yeah.
But if you are doing this to monetize it, what is your long-term goal? Tell me.
Totally. So the short-term goal, although I can already monetize it by having external sponsors, I still do sponsorships, but I sponsor it with my own company, so that's very much internal. But I can take on external sponsor, and that's an immediate way of opening up that monetization. But I choose not to do it to still focus on the growth of the podcast and bring on guests and get those insights in front of everyone. And the long-term goal is to obviously turn it into an asset management VC company, venture capital firm, which invests in India, early stages, and then later on across the world when it grows. So that's the goal with it.
Very good. Just the kind of answer I was looking for. So I've got three takeaways from what you've said, and
Right.
that is going to tie back to what you asked me. Okay.
Okay.
Number one is that you are creating monetization in the short term to sustain life and livelihood, right? In some form. Perhaps you have other avenues as well, but this is a contributor, right? The number one point is basically, I would say, it's a blank canvas in terms of where everybody sits on the same page. Everybody basically needs to sustain life and sustain family and sustain dependence and sustain habits or passions or whatever it is, right? Of course, that is a scale. You could just sustain, or you could sustain beautifully, or you could sustain with, all your whims and fancies being, fulfilled, right? We're not going to go into that. We're just talking about pure point one, sustenance. Every family today, regardless of whether they're a 10 billion net worth family office or they're affluent professional and with, I would say, barely any net worth, everybody starts from the point of sustenance. And that is exactly what family offices always need to remember. Or I would even say every investor, every human being today, be it an investment banker who is just professionally employed, who may have the potential of eventually becoming a family office, will fail if they forget that the number one reason why we do what we do is sustenance. Why do we see wealth getting blown up? Because people forget it starts with sustenance. It's about food on the table and shelter over your head. The second point that you made was that you will end up meeting interesting people, creating a universe of, friends, business acquaintances, a network, right? I don't like the word network because it tends to nowadays have a very negative connotation to it, because everybody seems to be networking. You go out to a party and people are networking. And I think that is the most horrible thing anyone can ever do, because one needs to just purely put yourself forward in the most authentic fashion without being goal oriented in each and every interaction we have with a human being, right? Because at the end of the day, even if you end up transacting with somebody you've met at an occasion, networked really well, it's not most likely going to be a long lasting relationship because you started off from a transactional point of view. So your point number two is again a very valid point that goes across the board, regardless of whether even today you're a family office or you're a high net worth professional, or you are an industrialist with limitless, pots of gold and bottomless pits of money. One has to understand that your relationships will take you the furthest. Now, whether those relationships are embarked upon authentically and with good intentions or well-intentioned, let's say, engagement, or whether they are purely created based on some immediate transaction requirement, but that needs to be made very clear from the beginning. So even today, you'll find family offices wanting to meet other family offices, wanting to connect with people who live the same life, have a similar net worth, have similar mindsets in terms of business, family office investment activities, global exposure, trying to expand, trying to create a legacy, whatever it may be. But there has to be some common ground. And on the basis of that common ground, you have to understand, is this relationship going to be a relationship or is it just going to be a transactional acquaintance, and make that very clear. Okay, and I say this to you as well. Moving forward, I hope you get your VC fund and you will find that your foundational relationships will be your biggest support and will probably end up being one of the core reasons for your success. Okay. Now, the last point. The last point is you want to create a VC fund. You have identified clearly, categorically, and decidedly that this is your goal. And which is exactly where most family offices, regardless of whether they're of a certain background or not, this applies to everyone and everybody's internal activities and way of thinking and thought processes. We do not clearly understand our own motivations, or we deny what we know to be our truest motivations. And that is where your first pitfall occurs in your life's trajectory, be it financial or otherwise.
Right.
And I think it's very, very important to reflect upon, and your motivations could be as superficial as they may be, or they could be more about impact, or they could be about community, humanity, climate change. It could be about legacy, and the legacy factor could be about creating a place for yourself which goes down in the books, in the pages of history. It could be about succession, making certain that if you are a second generation affluent, high net worth individual, your 20th generation remains that. Okay, that would be the ideal way to look at it, because everything else will fall into place as soon as you look at everything from a succession point of view and a legacy point of view, which is not purely material legacy, but material is part of a more 360-degree legacy creation framework. So to answer your question in the most convoluted and long-winded way, which is the only way I know how to answer questions, is that every family office, regardless of background, geographical, positioning, must look at these three key factors, and probably do look at and all these three factors whilst conducting their family office or investment activities.
Totally. Thanks for sharing that. And you also have a private equity firm, which is called Auctus Fora. So tell us how you're applying these money management tips that you shared for family offices, because you say you're taking a family office approach to investing at your private equity firm, right? So what does that mean?
So it's Auctus Fora, not
Okay.
Flo-
Okay. Sorry about that.
Oh no, don't be sorry. Just making sure we get the facts
Sure.
right.
Sure.
The Auctus Fora is not, I would not call it a private equity firm. It's a platform for family offices to come together and co-invest. There's no co-mingled investment vehicle. There is no fund. There is no captive holding of other people's capital. And I would say the management aspect is more at the initial stages. So I'll take a step back and I'll try and rush through this because I know we're running a bit out of time. Family offices are, after a certain point of, say, liquid net worth, and I'm not talking about net worth from the point of view that cumulative net worth, liquidity threshold has to be hit, which we have a minimum threshold. If a family office meets that threshold, then they obviously are an entity or are a group of members that we would be happy to work with. We don't go out and raise capital. We don't pitch. What we do is we meet people and we understand people. And then if we like those people and they like us back, more importantly, we create a relationship. It's a very small universe of family offices, like I said, with a minimum threshold of liquid net worth, and then, of course, whatever their overall net worth may be. And we work together as one team and co-invest. We don't believe in the standard mainstream asset management fees, because for us it's not about the greed and the earnings and the return. It is more about the fact that we should be able to participate in opportunities together that we all have consensus upon, because clearly they have reached a stage in their life, in their net worth, in their trajectory of success, which has given them enough experience, astuteness, and I would say expertise. It could be a specific subject or sector-centric subject matter expertise, or sector-centric expertise, or it could be more broad spectrum. But the idea is that that person knows what they're doing, and we are able to access that knowledge and information, and they in turn access ours. And we work together, and we always invest slices of capital. There'll never be an opportunity where we have made someone invest or allocate capital to where we haven't put in a slice. It could be a much smaller slice from our own balance sheet, but the interests are always aligned. We all need to make sure that our finger is in the same pie at the same time. So everybody is motivated to make sure that the investment does well, or sometimes when it so happens that it's not doing terribly well, we all come together to bolster it, to make certain that the right decisions are made and the trajectory corrected, if possible, given the circumstances. So that is the whole fundamental behind this platform, and like I said, it's literally, and I can today very happily say that every family that we have worked with, do work with, and probably will continue working with are family to us. They're not investors, they're not clients, they are family. We travel together, we entertain each other, we host each other, we call each other when there's a personal issue in our lives. We mentor young people from each other's families, and it's literally like a Indian joint family, if that makes any sense. And like I said, it's come down to the basic fundamentals of life: the right company, the most authentic engagement with the people you surround yourself with, and then once you have all of that, you just put your best work forward to make it work for everybody, including yourself.
Totally, that's a great look into it. And you said like your motivations are not limited to your financial motivations or the growth and preservation of the capital that's there, but it's much beyond that and creating impact in the world, right? So when you're evaluating these investment opportunities, how much in importance do you weigh the impact aspect and the wealth or the capital growth aspect? How much do they weigh in your opinion?
So we have something called a capital intentions matrix that is visited every morning during our internal meetings. Even if it's a virtual meeting, the first spotlight is on the capital intentions matrix. So when we are making an investment decision, we start with capital intentions, which has a dual meaning. What do we intend to do with this capital? And are our intentions of a capital nature? Using the pun on the word. So capital intentions, how do we see our investment making an impact? So we build in the impact component into our investment activities, which I have found is probably the most consistent and sustainable way to address impact in a portfolio. Because, of course, there can be philanthropic foundations, but when you have a portfolio of assets and you're running a family office, the philanthropy part ends up becoming a very mechanical process, right? And you're no longer truly engaged with it. It's just about, yep, these are our panel of charities or causes, and we will allocate X, Y, and Z to them on an annual basis. It's mechanical. You're not truly engaged with anything. You're not even seeing the result of what of the contributions that you're making. So, in my opinion, if you are willing to build in, so for example, as you said, if I was to draw a comparison between is return more important or is the impact, I would say they're equally important, because the way we build an impact into an investment, into an asset, is that if our asset doesn't perform to a bare minimum, let's say benchmark, then the impact component suffers, right? And the impact component is tied into, say, local employment, creating utilities and infrastructure for that, say, for that specific area, or having a component of the revenues and allocated across to X cause, right? So now if we built it in, so now if we are not generating X%, automatically Y% also falls, which is the allocation that is going out to a certain cause, right? So if you do that with each investment, and if you focus that investment based on where that investment sits from a location perspective, and then you look at all the needs of that area, of that zone, and then you strategically decide which are the ones that you can and are willing to adopt that organically feed into the investment that you've just made, or vice versa. So for us, that model has really worked brilliantly, and we were quite happy with it. So that is how we would draw a comparison or a parallel between returns and impact, and how we build it into our ongoing operations.
Right. Totally. And coming to my last main question for the limitation of time, you have advocated for an international council of family offices to strive the world in the right direction. Why do you advocate for this?
So I've created a platform called the Power of Policy platform, which is basically a platform to address better policy making, more pragmatic policy making that addresses the crisis of global governance, which addresses the truth deficit that prevails across humanity today, that addresses the economic landscapes of countries being heavily impacted by geopolitical crises and weaponization of interdependence, which one could say has been self-invited in a certain sense, but we don't have time to go into that. So when I say let's create an international investment council, there are many components to it. One of the components is that the family offices of certain size, influence, and profile have the biggest influence on geopolitical matters via their local or international political influences and their connections, or their government directly. And that ability needs to be utilized not by one very high net worth or two very high net worth people influencing political agendas and policies, but a council of family officers coming together to actually put in place enough of a framework, enough of an impactful framework to influence policy across the board, and to be able to, I would say, in some way or in a very effective way, overcome those sectional high net worth individuals endeavoring to impact policy and have in the past succeeded to the detriment of humanity, country, and politics, I would say, and to a large extent. So that is one component of it. The other component is that I think an international investment council, outside of the family office component of it, or a council of family offices, would be the most incredible endeavor to create more efficacy and seamless flow of capital, or a bridge of capital inflow and outflow between India and other countries. At the moment, we do not have a quality assured, blue chipped, decoded, properly calibrated pipeline of projects that private capital, which is still very shy of the geopolitical risk, or I would say regulatory risk of that India still represents, would become more comfortable with being able to come into India. We have 126 odd trillion in private capital in fund structures. We have family office capital, which also goes into the trillions, that is still not looking at India as their first destination for capital allocation. Whereas we have the economic robustness, we have the fundamentals in place, we are on the right trajectory, and we're probably going to continue getting better based on the policy framework that is now in play, and hopefully will continue to improve. But the issue still remains that we do not have quality assured pipeline of projects. I'm not even talking about the large scale projects, I'm saying from the SME sector all the way up. If private capital is truly to look at India from a private equity perspective or a private structured credit perspective, outside of purely just listed securities, which would also benefit, I think we need to create a platform which allows for a more appetizing creation of a framework for investment capital to come into India. And this can only be done by creating, first of all, the right macro and micro level policies within the country, but also to a large extent, it needs to follow the same model that Australia did with its blue chipping of infrastructure projects, where they went through an end-to-end exercise of making certain that the project has been de-risked of all the elements that obviously are discouraging to an international investor, be it private, public, or family office, to come into a particular asset or to enter a country with their investment capital. So those would be the first two reasons, and of course there are many others which are components of what an international investment council should be made of. But we don't have enough time, so I'm going to stop there.
Right, totally. That's a great point there on how India can present its and boost its case for international investments. And now, to close this out, can we quickly do the rapid fire round? I'll ask you three quick questions about the investing you're doing, and you have to give three quick answers. So, the first one is, what are the sectors and regions you invest in?
We're globally opportunistic. We tend to shy away from technology and telecommunications, unless, of course, it is something that will create, which will unlock perhaps further intrinsic value in our pre existing portfolio assets. And then, of course, we are willing to look at strategic tech investments for a specific portfolio asset. But overarchingly, we don't look at tech and telecom.
Got it. And what's the typical stage of investment?
We're private equity, so late stage.
Okay. Where can our listeners follow you?
Well, as long as they're not following me by car or by foot, I'm quite happy for them to find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Actually, to be quite honest, LinkedIn, I don't really, I don't directly engage on LinkedIn much unless I'm posting. But yes, I think Instagram more personal, but also there's some work centric sort of content there. But it is a public profile. But I would say Twitter is probably, from a professional perspective, the ideal follow, place.
Awesome. I'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes below so that our listeners can get there easily. Thanks so much for making time for this. I'm truly honored and grateful for the time you've allowed us on the VC10X podcast.
Not at all, Prashant. Thank you so much. You've been so accommodating and so generous with your time and your flexibility. It is so appreciated, and it's been a privilege having a chat with you. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.
Same to you. Thank you.